I think we talked about this before, but it seems to me like there is a complete loss of dimensionality.
Sure. Well, dimensionality is discovered to be arbitrary. So there can be various degrees of dimensionality, and they're all basically virtual. And so you can kind of
They're sort of fantasy created.
Yeah, you can kind of slip in and out of them, or out of them altogether, or whatever, and you discover that they're not actually inherent in situations. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's part of the extreme strangeness of what this is. Because of that fact, it can be seen in so many different ways.
Well, I notice how much energy I put into maintaining dimensionality.
Yeah, right. Well, typically we do.
Yeah. But a lot of it is just, when I actually look and see, there isn't any there.
Yeah. And when you let go of that maintaining, that proves to be actually kind of nice, because first of all, of course, it's a lot easier, and second of all, the fact of being a little more fancy-free with dimensionality means you can slip in and out of whatever one seems to be convenient at the time, rather than needing to be more linear with it or make more sense. So you have kind of random access to very different ways of being with the same experience, rather than holding yourself to being with it in a certain way with some consistency, which it proves to be quite advantageous.
Yeah, it seems to me like some of the superheroes probably were quite good at that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the essence of what's called magic or shamanism, is this flexibility of dimensionality and the ability to be with the same experience in terms of vastly different dimensionalities. The same experience can essentially transform itself with various degrees of extremity into an entirely new and previously unanticipated modes.
It seems to me that conventionally that I've had a very limited dimensionality that I have existed, have tried to maintain, even though I have done a very poor job of that.
Sure, yeah. It's very typical. I mean, that's the common human viewpoint, probably, for people that have more or less a well-structured personality or well-structured orientation to a human framework, is to sort of have a good sort of a hold on a sort of a consistent dimensionality. Then people who are more borderline and more, then you get to schizophrenics and people like that, and they're all over the place. So they aren't very good at doing that at all. But allowing yourself to be more free and easy with dimensionality enables you to take care of the flexibility that something like schizophrenia may offer without needing to be stuck in it. So you can be with various modes simultaneously that can be more or less radical, more or less irrational, and you're not stuck in any of them. You have more freedom of navigation, you might say. I mean, it's another aspect of liberation, is the discovery that you aren't actually constrained to be with your experience any particular way. So you can slip through it with great ease and devil-may-careness in any mode that seems to show up, which can be both pleasurable and advantageous.
When we get back to the idea of filters, which when a mode shows up, it's a mode that's seen through a filter, and it's difficult to see beyond that filter because the filter is pervasive.
Yeah. Yeah, again, all these dimensionalities are essentially filters. And again, this gets down to sort of stumbling onto the knack of flexibility with those modes. Because ultimately, it's we ourselves who maintain the rigidity of those modes, even if we feel trapped in them. We are ourselves supplying that, holding it, the importance of holding it to be a certain way. And so when you discover that and let go of that holding, things can loosen up considerably. Obviously, it's not something we do deliberately most of the time, but nonetheless it's being done more or less deliberately by the individual. So we build our own prisons.
But it seems too that the sense of holding is just an attempt by this to have one see that there is that is in fact the case.
Yeah, absolutely, sure. It's like an egg.
Like it doesn't matter which one it is you're holding.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, just the perception of that is the important thing.
Yeah. We do it in order to learn to outgrow doing the need to do it, or the obsession with doing it. I mean, it's a nice analogy. I don't know if it's an analogy, but it's a kind of a neat little metaphor that we construct a more or less rigid reality for ourselves, like the way that an infant bird a chick is inside an eggshell, solely so that we can, in the process of maturing, break out of it. And whether or not that's true in any literal sense, it's apt, because that's what seems to be more or less the case. Spiritual unfoldment consists of essentially coming to see that we don't need to be contained within the relatively narrow worldviews that we have been in the habit of holding as essential or urgent, or that we feel dependent upon. And then we discover a greater degree of freedom and intrinsic safety, or let's say inclusive belonging, that is independent of needing things to be safe, or needing things to be controlled, or needing things to make sense. Perhaps a better analogy would be to say that it's like a house that we imagine we live in, that we never leave, or don't know we can leave, and eventually we discover that the doors aren't locked and they're standing open, and we can leave the house anytime we want, because we can also go back anytime we want. The analogy with the eggshell isn't quite so good, because the eggshell gets shattered irrevocably when the chick leaves it. But in actuality, we discover we have freedom to depart from our habitual perspective, but in actuality we can return to it and depart from it, come and go as we please, with absolute liberty.
a Hotel California. The song. Check out any time you like, you can never leave.
But that's a very pessimistic viewpoint,
Yeah,
you know.
I have to reword that.
We had other objections with that song.
You know, again, the actuality is more like well, Christ is supposed to have said a wonderful statement, something to the effect of, in my, what do you say, my Father's mansion.
Oh. I go to prepare a place for you.
Yeah, but in my Father's mansion there are many rooms, in my Father's house there's many, I don't know what, anyway.
Yeah.
The point being, the image of imagine a castle with infinite rooms, and we're used to living in one room, and we don't even know we can leave it. We just think it's our entire environment. And one day we discover the door's ajar, and we can open it anytime we want. We can go into any of the other rooms we want anytime we want, and we can come back to the first room that we were used to hanging out in anytime we want. And we discover we have freedom to be in any mode that we choose to go to, and so we can freely navigate and come and go as we want.
I mean, throughout my life, I've always had this sort of progressive dream about a house. And the house is always different, you know, but it's still recognizable.
Uh-huh.
And that, you know, at different times in my life, there'll be like a whole new wing has appeared on the house, or where I'll be like, wow. Certain things will take place there, but it's very clear that it is, you know, the same house. It's just the evolution of things.
Sure. Yeah.
Access is an interesting way of talking about a multiplicity of experience.
Sure.
So, you have the access because you have being,
Mm-hmm.
but is it? I guess it would also be based on knowing that you can find or participate or experience
Mhm.
other ways of.
Sure. The fact that you have being means that you have absolute power, absolute authority, absolute identity with the very root of reality itself. And yet being seems to come to know itself with varying degrees of maturity. And as it reaches a certain point of maturity and being with itself, it begins to recognize some of its own properties and characteristics and begins to take advantage of some of its own powers, most of which, or I should say all of which, consist of the discovery of the ability to explore these alternative ways of being with itself, these alternative possibilities that it intrinsically contains within itself. When it's immature with itself, it tends to take itself excluding the full range of its own possibilities and abilities. And so as it matures in its way of being with itself, it comes to become aware of these possibilities and takes advantage of them and explores them and learns about them through exploration. And this seems to be a spontaneous intrinsic process in being itself that plays itself out in the unfoldment of any individual when they reach a certain point in their own spontaneous, inherent spiritual unfoldment, that they begin to explore these things. And it certainly looks like access, or looks like the beginning of knowing that these things are possible, which then allows an exploration of these possibilities and a discovery of what that is, and these relatively enhanced modes and abilities and liberties that are intrinsically available because of what being is, and it discovers that this is the case when it allows itself to. Yeah?
has a kind of quality of I can't think of the word, but just having things happen
Spontaneity, you mean?
as opposed to doership or involvement or
Sure.
I know it's all the same thing, but still.
Sure. You can't do these things intentionally
No, you
until
can't find it
until you start to be able to, which again happens spontaneously as you begin to move into a more mature relationship with what you are, which again happens inherently and spontaneously because of your own, call it spiritual growth, or spiritual unfoldment, or spiritual maturing process, whatever it is. I mean, all this is very sort of loose and metaphorical. Whatever is actually going on can't be said, but to a large degree it looks as if it was more or less like that.
Traditionally, there have been practices to open one's self to.
Sure. But again, you can't effectively avail yourself of those practices, or you won't even be interested in exploring those practices until you reach a point in your own unfoldment where it becomes interesting and/or meaningful to do so. And if you haven't reached a sufficient point, even if you engage in such practices, you'll do so immaturely, and you won't really take advantage of them, be able to take advantage of them as fully as you potentially could if you were mature enough to be able to see what they actually were.
They might perhaps unfold more spontaneously, or if one pursues that directly. Instead of waiting for it to happen, waiting to mature.
Well, but you won't pursue that unless you are mature.
Right, okay, so suppose someone pursues it.
If they are mature, then we see this all the time in spirituality. It's easy to do spiritual practices and even to think you're making headway and becoming an expert at it, and still entirely miss the point and not actually discover what's there. There are many expert meditators who've been meditating for 30 and 40 years who are dullards. And yet, if you're inspired, if you're mature, you can meditate for a very short period of time and see the point of meditation, and just use meditation for what it's intended to be for, which is a means to an end. Meditation is not an end to itself.
Right.
It's a means of exploring what this is. And to do that effectively, you have to be at a certain point of maturity. That it can't be faked. You can go through the motions. You can sit down and try to meditate, 4 hours a day or whatever. But it's not going to do you any good until you're ready for it to do you some good, and that's not something you can fake or can try, because it has to come from your actual maturity, your readiness, you might say. You have to be ripe, as they say in some traditions. They say you have to be ripe, a ripe spiritual aspirant.
Use fertilizer to get yourself right.
You can try, but again, you won't be effective unless you're ready for it to be effective. And the sign that you're ready is if it works. Because the essence of all this stuff is recognition. And recognition demands intelligence, which will not be there with sufficient sensitivity if there isn't maturity.
Well, you can be proactive.
fine. But again, whether or not you're, I mean, I don't understand what your point of argument in all this is.
Oh, I didn't mean to argue.
No, I don't mean argument. I'm not really sure where you're going with all this.
Deposition,
She's saying she wants to try to become enlightened. Right?
Well, you're doing a good job of it.
Well, it's like wherever you are, there's more. Or there's a kind of fluidity that you know you have or you don't. And there's a kind of static quality that you know you have or you don't.
Right.
So there's lots of awarenesses and recognitions that come, but there's a fundamental kind of openness and moving into multiplicities and diversities and or not. And opening to that is there's a truth to what that is.
Yes.
And having that be your experience is seductive.
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't particularly want to sit back and wait till I mature.
But you don't need to wait.
We don't hear that happening there,
Which, the waiting or the maturity?
Waiting for maturity.
All of this talk of maturity is not a counsel of waiting; it's a counsel of taking advantage.
Well,
Take advantage of whatever degree of maturity you have, by all means. Because that gives you freedom, that gives you access, that gives you power of mobility, power to explore, power to be with alternatives, power to be more non-linear and less literal in being with your experience. And you have that to the degree you do, and by all means take advantage of the degree to which you have it. And no one has none at all.
no, actually, I think the drive is what prevents it from happening.
It can be, but drive itself is an immature. Drive itself is an inherently immature mode.
I know.
You know. But again, coming to see that is a sign of maturity.
It comes down to just not giving a shit.
Yeah. Ease, being with the inherent spontaneity and honoring and coming to appreciate the actual power of that. You know, rather than thinking that, an immature stance is thinking you know better. You know better than God, and you're going to find a way to trick him, her. And a more mature stance is coming to see, oh my God, what this inherently is and what it's doing is inconceivably powerful and beautiful and right on the fucking money. And so you come to honor that and come to see and appreciate the power and exquisite perfection of that. Which again, it definitely looks like a seduction. It looks like, oh yeah, I get it now. Finally, I can, where I am is exactly where I'm supposed to be, and it's inconceivably beautiful. And thank God I'm came to be here. Thank God I'm me. And that's what becoming more mature looks like. And again, it does come. The good news about maturing is it's always happening inevitably. Everyone is on an arc of maturing. To exist is to be on an arc of maturing. To be actively moving into greater maturity constantly.
The marble has been let go.
It's an interesting concept of everybody maturing.
Takes a long time.
It seems to presuppose that there is path.
Sure.
Or am I? Okay.
You could say that, but it's the nature. I mean, you could also just call it entropy, or the Big Bang, or
Okay.
the will of God, or the primal
So
radiance
it's
of
actually
Shakti.
a path.
It's not so much a path as a dynamism
Yeah.
that moves in its own vector, which we can interpret as arguably as what I'm calling unfolding and all that.
Yes.
But that's just the arbitrary way of spinning it.
And so, I mean, part of the thing is just to look and see clearly what maturity really is.
Yeah, sure.
As opposed to what we think it is.
Yeah. And maturity is what grants the ability to do that. The ability to look at this and appreciate it and go, wow. There's a lot going on here, and it's profound. And that's a mature viewpoint, as opposed to an immature viewpoint, which is more grasping and disputive and so on.
Well, you could say it's also putting out the welcome mat.
Sure.
This is interesting. So, it's not necessarily beautiful, though, because I
Right.
feel like Hitler had an amazing maturity of
Sure.
sorts.
Of course.
Like Beyond, and
Sure.
Napoleon, I guess you could throw in there.
Sure.
But it's not necessarily beautiful, or maybe it is. It's just how I define it, given my
Yeah.
perspective upon
Sure.
that. There's a lot of beauty that came out of the contrast or the paradox of
Yeah.
something like that happening. But I mean, his maturity was definitely there.
Sure, absolutely. And again, beauty is a matter of intricate, let's say intricacy of pattern. As you cut open a head of cabbage and it's beautiful, just because of all this amazing squiggle. You look at an ant's nest that's been stepped on, all the ants running around. It's beautiful. It's not that it's not. Again, beauty is in the sort of in the information content, rather than it being good as opposed to bad, or pretty as opposed to ugly, or attractive as opposed to unattractive, which is a more from a sort of within a cultural specific framework.
Okay, it's like the unfolding of the maturity is beautiful.
And as the maturity proceeds to unfold, the perception of the intrinsic beauty of the intelligence itself, of all this amazing patterning that all phenomena consist of, it just develops as well. And you look at anything and you go, wow, this is amazing. I mean, I like it, but it's amazing.
Exactly.
What this is intrinsically the very essence of beauty, the very essence of intelligence, the very essence of meaningfulness, the very essence of functionality, and all those are one and the same. And all of this elaboration, all of this inconceivable patterning, and the way the patternings unfold themselves and interact with themselves, and all of that, I mean, universes and beings and civilization and worlds and all of this stuff, it's mind-blowingly exquisite. What a machine, what an art form. What a trip. This is just it's mind-boggling. And seeing the truth of that, seeing the power of that, is to also come to see the truth and power of what we are, and of what our lives are, and what is doing all of that. And it's really sort of settling into the broader perspective of the fundamental values that are actually here, rather than more superficial, bigoted, biased values of a personal perspective, or some, simplistic cultural definitions or whatever. And the eclipse we saw today, that these celestial bodies are in motion and they line up in certain ways, which changes the way radiation appears on this planet and all. I mean, it's just this astounding, inconceivable intricacy of interrelationship, and energy responsiveness that is just ongoing around us.
It's as if consciousness hides itself from itself to appreciate itself.
Sure.
Eventually.
Yeah, it's like that, isn't it? It's kind of like that.
Here,
you mentioned that the waking state and the dream state are, it's all the same stuff that's happening.
Yes.
And I've recently, just this year, have started dreaming, but the dreams, the content in the dreams is about spiritual people that I know.
Mm-hmm.
And
Good, you're very fortunate.
yeah. And the thing is that I don't identify a bit with anything in the dream, but yet I have all of this identification going on in the waking state. And so I guess that's just the mode of the waking state, is where there's that facility, that identification facility that keeps you engaged in the content, which doesn't happen in the dream state.
Sure, perhaps it depends upon your individual nature and your temperament. But you can certainly, if that's the case for you, then you can certainly see it. Well, it's about quitting time. This is my last meeting before the retreat, which I expect I'll see some of you at in a week and a half. For those anyone online who can't attend that or isn't attending that, I will be broadcasting the evening sessions during the retreat, and I'll put those times up on the website. And otherwise, my next meeting will be at Hillside Club on, what is it, the 5th or something? Yeah, I think the 5th.
Yeah.
So, good night. Good night and God bless.
Good night. God bless.